The thing Renee would remember about that night, even months later when she had a different life and a different name on her bank statements, was the way her husband laughed when he pointed at her wrist. The private dining room at Crestwood Steakhouse was the kind of place that smelled like leather and cedar and money that did not need to announce itself. There were 9 seats at the long table, set with heavy white linens and crystal glasses that caught the soft amber light from the chandelier above. Renee was the only wife present. Brent had told her 2 weeks before that the dinner was important. He had told her to wear something nice. He had picked out the dress himself, a navy blue sheath with 3/4 sleeves, modest and proper, the kind of dress that did not draw attention. He had also told her, with that small smile he used when he wanted something, not to wear that watch. She had worn it anyway. She had worn it every day for 16 years. It was the watch her grandmother Pearl had given her 3 weeks before she passed. It had a thin gold case the color of pale honey, a cream face with simple Roman numerals, and a worn brown leather strap that Renee had replaced exactly twice in all those years. Pearl had pressed it into her hand on a Tuesday afternoon in the kitchen of the small house in Queens, New York, where Pearl had lived for 40 years, and she had said, "This matters. Wear it. Promise me." Renee had promised. She kept her promises. So she sat at the table at Crestwood with her grandmother's watch on her wrist and listened to her husband and his colleagues from Holloway Industrial talk about quarterly numbers and a contract with a logistics firm in Greensboro. The men at the table were all directors and senior managers. They were men who liked the sound of their own voices. Brent was, as usual, the loudest of them. Tasha sat 2 seats down from Brent. Tasha was Brent's executive assistant, and she had been invited because Brent had said, when he came home that morning, that the keynote guest was a private investor named Howard Veracruz and that Tasha had been the one to coordinate the logistics of the dinner. Renee had nodded and not said anything about how it was unusual for an assistant to attend the same dinner as her boss's wife. She had been doing a lot of not saying things in the last few months. She had a list of them in her head. Tasha wore a black sleeveless dress and pearl earrings and had her glossy bob tucked behind her ears. She laughed at everything Brent said. She laughed before he was even fully done saying it sometimes. Renee watched her from across the table. She watched her the way a person watches a small, busy animal. Without judgment. Just observation. The first course arrived. The men kept talking. Renee picked up her water glass and the gold case of the watch caught the light, and Brent saw it. He set down his bourbon. He leaned back in his chair. He raised his voice just slightly so the whole table could hear him. He said, "Gentlemen, you have got to see this." The men at the table turned. Brent said, "My wife refuses to take off this watch. I have bought her 2 nicer ones in the last 3 years. Both are sitting in a drawer at home. She wears this $40 thing, every single day. Even tonight. Even to a place like this." He laughed. Tasha laughed. She laughed the loudest. The other men laughed because Brent had laughed the way men do at tables like that. Renee felt the heat come up the back of her neck. She did not move her hand. She did not pull her sleeve down over the watch. She let it sit on her wrist exactly where it had been. She said, in a voice that was very quiet but very clear, "My grandmother gave me this watch." Brent waved his hand. He said, "Baby, your grandmother loved you. That does not mean the watch is not from a strip mall." The men laughed again. One of them, an older man named Dale, looked at Renee for a fraction of a second with what might have been sympathy. He looked away quickly. Renee said nothing. She picked up her napkin. She placed it in her lap. She looked down at her plate and did not look up for almost a full minute. When she did look up, she looked at her husband and she looked at him for long enough that the man next to him noticed and shifted in his chair. Brent did not notice. Brent had moved on to a story about a deal he had closed in Raleigh. That was when the door at the far end of the dining room opened, and Howard Veracruz walked in. He was alone. He was a small man, maybe 5'8", with silver hair combed neatly back and a deep tan that suggested either a winter in the Caribbean or a lifetime of attention to himself. He wore a plain navy suit and no tie. He carried a leather portfolio in one hand. He looked like someone who had once been very handsome and had aged into a quieter version of the same. The table stood up. The men shook his hand in turn. Brent introduced himself with the practiced warmth of a man who had been waiting for this introduction. Howard shook his hand and nodded politely and looked around the table. The only empty seat was directly across from Renee. He sat down. He looked across the table. He looked at Renee briefly, and nodded the way a guest nods at the wife of a host. Then his eyes dropped to her water glass and to the hand holding it, and to the watch on her wrist. He went very still. Renee saw it happen. She had spent her whole career watching faces, watching the small involuntary tells of clients who were about to admit they had been hiding income, watching the way people's pupils changed when they were caught off guard. Howard Veracruz was a man trained in not showing anything. And for the briefest moment he showed everything. His face went pale. The color drained out of his deep tan and left something else underneath, something that looked like grief. He recovered in 2 seconds. He picked up his water glass. He smiled at the table. He apologized for being late. He thanked the men for waiting. He praised the wine. But Renee had seen. The dinner went on. Brent talked about the contract pipeline. Howard listened politely and asked good questions and drank very little. Tasha refilled glasses and laughed. The waiters came and went. About 40 minutes in, between the entree and the dessert course, Howard set down his fork. He looked across the table at Renee. He said, "Ma'am, may I ask that watch you are wearing? Where did you get it?" The table went a little quieter. Brent laughed and said, "Oh God, sir, please do not encourage her. She is going to tell you the whole story." Howard did not look at Brent. He kept his eyes on Renee. He said, "I would actually like to hear the whole story." Renee held his look. Her hands were calm in her lap. She felt very far away from the table all of a sudden, like she was watching the dinner from the doorway. She said, "My grandmother gave it to me. Her name was Pearl Mosley. She passed 16 years ago." Howard nodded slowly. He said, "Mrs. Caldwell, would you mind very much stepping into the lobby with me for a moment? Just for a brief word. Your husband can spare you for 2 minutes." Brent's smile flickered. He said, "Of course, sir. Absolutely." Renee stood up. She left her napkin on her chair. She walked across the dining room with Howard Veracruz behind her, and she did not look at her husband as she went, and she did not look at Tasha either. The door closed behind them. Tasha, in the quiet that followed, said something low to Brent. Brent laughed too loudly. In the lobby, Howard Veracruz stopped under a sconce and looked at Renee, and his face was doing the thing again, the pale thing, the thing it had been doing since the moment he sat down. He looked at her wrist. He looked at her face. He took a breath. He said, "Mrs. Caldwell, I need you to tell me everything you know about that watch." Renee looked at him. Her grandmother's voice was in her head. "This matters. Wear it. Promise me." She said, "I think you had better tell me first what you know about it." Howard Veracruz almost smiled. He nodded once. He said that would be fair. He gestured toward 2 leather chairs by the window. He said, "Please sit down." Renee sat. She rested her hand on the arm of the chair, and the watch caught the light, and Howard Veracruz looked at it the way a man looks at something he had given up on ever seeing again. She did not know it yet, but the next 60 seconds were going to change every single thing about her life. Howard Veracruz did not waste time. He waited until Renee was settled in the leather chair, then he sat down across from her and rested his portfolio on his knees and looked at her the way a doctor looks at a patient before delivering the diagnosis. He chose his words carefully. He said, "Mrs. Caldwell, before I tell you what I think, I need to ask you a few questions. Nothing personal. Just facts. Are you willing to answer them?" Renee said yes. He said, "Your grandmother, Pearl Mosley, where did she live and work?" Renee said, "She lived in Queens, New York for most of my life. Before that, she lived in Manhattan. She worked as a private secretary from when she was 19 years old until she retired at 64. She passed at 79. Howard nodded slowly. Each piece of information seemed to settle into place somewhere behind his eyes. He said, "Do you know who she worked for?" Renee thought. She had not had to recall this in a long time. Pearl had told her stories, but Pearl had not been the kind of woman to drop names. She had spoken about her work in general terms. Renee searched her memory. She said she worked for a man named Mr. Hollings. She always called him Mr. Hollings. I think he had a financial firm in Manhattan. She worked for him from the time she was very young. She stayed with him for almost 30 years, I think. After he passed, she retired. Howard closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, the look on his face had softened into something close to sadness. He said, "Bertram Hollings." Renee said, "That is the name." "Yes." Howard set the portfolio aside. He folded his hands in his lap and looked at her with a directness that was almost gentle. He said, "Bertram Hollings was my mentor. He gave me my first real job in 1979 when I was 20 years old and very poor and had no business being in a Manhattan boardroom. He died in 1981. I have been telling people the story of Bertram Hollings for almost 45 years, and most of them stop listening after about 3 minutes. I do not stop telling it." Renee did not say anything. She let him speak. Howard said, "Your grandmother, Pearl. I never had the privilege of meeting her. By the time I started working for Bertram, she had already left the firm. She had gone to take care of her sister, I believe, who had become unwell. But Bertram talked about her almost every day. She had been with him for the entirety of his career. She had run his life frankly. He told me once that everything he had achieved was built on the spine of a woman who had typed his letters and managed his calendars and corrected his grammar for 30 years. Renee felt her throat tighten. She did not let it show. Howard said, Bertram had one piece of jewelry that I ever saw him wear, which was his father's wedding band. He was not a flashy man. But in 1963, after a particular financial transaction that made him a great deal of money, he commissioned one custom piece from a watchmaker in Geneva. It was a thin gold dress watch designed quietly with a cream face and Roman numerals. It was not a man's watch and it was not a woman's watch in the obvious senses of those terms. It was simply a piece of beautiful, careful work. He had it engraved on the inside of the case back. And he gave it to Pearl. As a gift. As a thank you. The records of that commission are still on file with the watchmaker. There was only ever one of them made. I've been looking for that watch for over 30 years. Renee looked down at her wrist. She turned the watch slowly. The honey gold case caught the light. She looked at the small worn leather strap her grandmother's wrist had filled, and which her own wrist had filled for 16 years. She looked back at Howard. She said, What is the engraving on the inside of the case back? Howard said, May I see it? Renee unbuckled the strap. She slid the watch off her wrist for the first time in 8 months. She handed it across to Howard. Howard took it the way a man receives something sacred. He turned it in his hand. He pressed his thumbnail against the side of the case back and the small panel popped open with the precision of perfect machining. He read the engraving. He held the watch in both hands for a moment, eyes closed. He said very quietly, For Pearl, with my deepest gratitude. He opened his eyes. He said, Mrs. Caldwell, I need you to listen carefully. I am not in a position to make any official claims tonight. There is going to need to be authentication, and there are going to need to be papers, and there is going to need to be a meeting with a man I trust who knows about these things. But I can tell you that you are wearing, on your wrist, the only known surviving piece of Bertram Holling's personal commission, and that I have been searching for this watch since the day his estate was catalogued in 1981. There were rumors that he had given it to her. The estate could never confirm. Pearl was not in New York at the time of his death. The watch was simply gone. Renee felt the room tilt very slightly. She said, My grandmother never wore it. Howard said, I'm sorry? Renee said, I never saw her wear this watch. Not once. She kept it in a small wooden box at the back of her closet. She gave it to me 3 weeks before she passed. She made me promise to wear it. She said it mattered. Howard nodded slowly. He said she would have known what it was. Bertram would have told her. She kept it and she did not wear it and she gave it to her granddaughter on her deathbed and she made her promise to wear it. Renee said yes. Howard said, Your grandmother was sending you a message, Mrs. Caldwell. I do not know what that message was exactly. But she did not give you that watch by accident. Renee closed her hand around the empty space on her wrist. She said, What happens now? Howard said, What happens now is your decision. I would like, with your permission, to have the watch examined by a horologist named Dr. Owen Bramble. He is the foremost authenticator of mid-century Geneva commissions in this country. He is in Charlotte for a private commission next week. I can arrange for him to look at the watch on a date that is convenient for you. If after that examination the authentication is what I believe it will be, there are some other matters we should discuss. There may be records in Bertram's estate that name your grandmother in ways she did not know about and that you do not know about. Those records have been sitting in a vault for 44 years. They are not going anywhere. We can take this at any pace you prefer. He handed the watch back to her. Renee took it. She buckled it back onto her wrist with hands that were almost steady. She said, I would like to think about this for a few days. Howard said, Of course. He took a card from his portfolio and wrote a number on the back. He said, This number reaches me directly. Not my office. Not my assistant. When you are ready to talk further, please call me. Take whatever time you need. He stood up. Renee stood up. She said, Mr. Veracruz, may I ask you one thing? He said, Of course. She said, How could you tell the moment you walked in that it was the watch? Howard smiled a small smile. He said, Bertram had a photograph of it taken the week he commissioned it. He kept it in the drawer of his desk. He showed it to me twice in the year and a half I worked with him. I have been looking at that photograph in my mind for 45 years, Mrs. Caldwell. I would have known that watch in any room in the world. He nodded to her. Then he gestured toward the dining room door. He said, Shall we? They walked back into the dining room together. The men at the table looked up as they returned. Brent's expression flickered. He had been wondering. Tasha's eyes narrowed by a fraction. Howard took his seat. He thanked Renee politely for the conversation. He said something complimentary about her grandmother to the table at large. He drank a small glass of port. He answered a few more business questions with grace. Then at 9:45 he stood, shook everyone's hand and left. Brent was riding high by the time he and Renee got into the car at the valet stand. He said, "What was that all about?" Renee said, "He asked about my grandmother. He used to know someone who worked with her." Brent laughed. He said, "See, I told you. $40 and a sob story can get you anywhere." Renee did not respond. She watched the city lights move past the window. Brent's phone lit up on the center console. She did not look at it directly. She did not need to. She saw the preview on the lock screen out of the corner of her eye. It said, "See you in 20. It was from Tasha. Brent reached over and turned the phone face down on the seat. He said, "Hey, listen. I have to swing back by the office for a bit. There is a thing with the Greensboro contract. I will probably be late. Do not wait up." Renee said, "All right." He pulled into their driveway and let her out. He did not get out of the car. He did not walk her to the door. He kissed her on the cheek through the open passenger window and pulled back out onto the street and was gone. Renee stood in the driveway for almost a full minute. She watched the taillights disappear at the end of the block. Then she went inside and she sat down at the kitchen island and she did not turn on the lights, and for 1 full hour she did not move. After that she picked up her phone and she called Camille. Camille Booker had a way of answering the phone that always made Renee feel like she had her best friend back in college, the one who could stay up until 4 in the morning over a kitchen table working through a problem. Camille said, "Hey, what's wrong?" Renee said, "I do not know if I am ready to say it out loud." Camille said, "Then do not. Just start somewhere. Anywhere. I am here." Renee started with the watch. It was easier to start with the watch than with the rest. She told Camille about the dinner. She told her about the way Brent had pointed at her wrist and laughed, and she told her about the way the table had laughed with him, and she told her about Tasha laughing the loudest. She told her about Howard Veracruz walking in late and going pale when he saw the watch. She told her what Howard had said to her in the lobby. She told her about Bertram Hollings and the engraving in the photograph Howard claimed to have looked at in his mind for 45 years. Camille was quiet for a long time after Renee finished. Then Camille said, "Sweetie, that is one half of a story. What is the other half?" Renee said, "On the way home, Brent's phone lit up. The message was from Tasha. It said, 'See you in 20. Camille said, "Oh." Renee said, "He told me he had to swing back by the office. He said it was about the Greensboro contract." "The Greensboro contract closed 3 weeks ago, Camille. I was the one who handled his expense report when the trip happened. He had a celebration dinner with the client. The contract is done." Camille said, "All right. So we have the watch and we have Tasha. How long have you had your eye on Tasha?" Renee thought. She said, 8 months, maybe 9. There were some changes. Small ones. The way he came home. The way he spoke about her at first too much and then suddenly not at all. The way he stopped letting me come to office events. He used to want me at things. Then he started not wanting me at things. Then tonight. He brought me tonight because Howard Veracruz was the keynote and he wanted to look like the family man. But he brought Tasha too, which makes no sense unless he wanted her in the room. Camille said, "He wanted both of you in the room because he likes the show of it." Renee said, "Yes." Camille said, "Are you sure you want to know what is happening?" Renee said, "I have known what is happening for months. I have just been letting myself pretend the knowing was not knowing." Camille said, "All right. Listen to me. We are not going to confront him tonight. We are not going to confront him this week. You are going to keep your routine looking exactly the way it has looked for the last 6 months. Cook the same dinners. Use the same towels. Run the same dishwasher. Smile at him at the breakfast table. Do you understand me?" Renee said, "Yes." Camille said, "While you are doing that, I'm going to do 3 things. I'm going to look at the financials. I'm going to look at the property records on the house. I'm going to put together a clean picture of where everything stands. Do you have your own bank account?" Renee said, "Yes. Always have. The joint account is for the mortgage and the utilities. My salary goes to my own account. His goes to his." Camille said, "Good. Good. That is going to help us." Renee said, "Camille." Camille said, "Yes." Renee said, "I'm not crying." Camille said, "I know." Renee said, "I should probably be crying." Camille said, "You will. Not tonight. Not even this week. But you will. And when you do, I will sit on the floor with you and you can soak my whole sweater and I will not move." Renee laughed. The laugh surprised her. It came out small and rough. She said, "Thank you." Camille said, "Get some sleep. Eat something tomorrow. Do not skip meals. I'm going to start pulling things tomorrow morning. I will call you Wednesday." They hung up. Renee sat at the kitchen island for another 20 minutes. Then she went upstairs and got into bed and closed her eyes. Brent came home at 3:15 in the morning. She heard the garage door. She heard him come up the stairs slowly. She heard him brush his teeth in the hallway bathroom instead of the master so he would not wake her. She kept her breathing even. He climbed into bed and was asleep within 5 minutes. Renee lay there beside him with her eyes open, and she did not sleep until almost 6. In the morning she made breakfast, eggs the way he liked them, toast cut on the diagonal, coffee from the small kettle. She set a plate in front of him and kissed him on the temple. He said, "You are a good wife, baby." She said, "Eat your eggs." He ate his eggs. She did not feel anything when she watched him eat. That was the part she would think about later. She had loved this man for 15 years. She had built a home with him. She had cried with him when his father passed. She had typed his graduate school applications when his hands were shaking. She had memorized his coffee order at every Starbucks within a 15-mile radius of every job he had ever had. And now she stood in the kitchen and watched him eat eggs she had cooked, and she did not feel anything. She drove to work at 7:30. The accounting firm where Renee had worked for 11 years occupied the 8th floor of a building in Midtown Charlotte. Her office was small but had a window. Her plants were healthy. Her files were in perfect order. She liked her work. She had never been a person who needed her job to be exciting in order to like it. She liked the steadiness of numbers. Numbers either added up or they did not. Janelle Whitfield poked her head into Renee's office at 8:20 and said, "I have your coffee." Renee said, "You are an angel." Janelle came in and set a paper cup on Renee's desk and sat down in the visitor's chair across from her. Janelle was 36 and had a young son and an older mother and a way of carrying both with grace. She was the only person at the firm who Renee had ever told anything personal to. Janelle looked at her. Janelle said, "You look tired." Renee said, "Dinner ran late." Janelle looked at her some more. Janelle said, "That is not the kind of tired that comes from a late dinner." Renee said, "I am fine." Janelle said, "All right. I will not push. But I am right here. I'm always right here. I work 2 doors down. You know where to find me." Renee said, "I know." Janelle stood up and squeezed Renee's shoulder and went back to her own office. Renee opened her email. She worked. She got through 3 account reconciliations and a phone call with a client and a quick lunch at her desk. By 2 in the afternoon, she had almost convinced herself the night before had happened to a different woman. Her phone buzzed at 3:20. It was Howard Veracruz. The message said, "No rush at all. Just a brief note. Dr. Bramble will be in Charlotte next Thursday. He is at our offices on Tryon Street from 1 to 4. If that day works for you, I will block the time. If it does not, we will find another. Sincerely, HV." Renee read the message twice. She wrote back, "Thursday at 1 is fine. Thank you." He replied within a minute, "Wonderful. I will be there." Renee set the phone down on her desk. She looked at it for a long moment. She picked it back up and texted Camille. "Veracruz arranged the watch authentication for next Thursday. Where are you on the other thing?" Camille wrote back 10 minutes later. "Working through the bank statements. We'll have a clearer picture by Friday. Have you noticed anything else?" Renee thought about it. She put the phone down and turned to her computer and began working through the email queue she had been ignoring for 2 weeks. It was an hour into that work when she found the email. The email was from a small accounting service called Marsh Allen that Renee had never heard of. It had been sent to her address by mistake, addressed Dear Renee, with a request to confirm receipt of an attached invoice. The invoice was for consulting services rendered. It was billed by a company called Pierce Advisory. The recipient of the services was Holloway Industrial. The amount was for $47,000. Renee opened the attachment. She read the invoice carefully. She read it again. The lead consultant on the engagement was listed as Jared Pierce. Renee did not move for a long moment. Then she opened a new browser tab and searched the name Pierce Advisory in the North Carolina Business Registry. The owner of record for Pierce Advisory was Jared Pierce, of an address in Concord. The company had been registered 11 months earlier. Its registered agent was a law firm Renee did not recognize. She searched the name Jared Pierce. The first result was a LinkedIn profile. Jared Pierce was 34 years old and lived in Concord and had previously worked as an operations manager at a small distribution firm. The relationship section of his profile listed one family connection: his sister, Tasha Pierce. Renee stared at the screen. She closed the browser tab. She did not download anything. She did not forward anything. She did not move. She picked up her phone and texted Camille. The text said, "I have something. It is bigger than what we thought." Camille drove over that night. She showed up at 9:20 with a laptop bag on her shoulder and a paper sack from the Vietnamese place on Park Road. She set the food on the kitchen island and looked at Renee. She said, "Where is he?" Renee said, "He texted 30 minutes ago. He is at a client dinner. He says he will be home around 11. Camille said, "Good. Show me what you found." Renee opened the laptop she had brought home from work. She showed Camille the email from Marsh Allen. She showed her the invoice from Pierce Advisory. She showed her Jared Pierce's LinkedIn profile and the family connection to Tasha. She showed her the registration date of the company. Camille looked at the dates. Camille said, 11 months ago. Renee said, "Yes." Camille said, "This is the same time period when Brent started his change in behavior." Renee said, "Yes." Camille said, "Walk me through what you know about how Holloway awards consulting contracts." Renee said, "I do not know all of it. But I know that contracts under $50,000 do not need full board approval. They are signed off at the director level. The Pierce Advisory invoice is for $47,000. It would have crossed Brent's desk and been approved by Brent." Camille said, "Has there been more than one?" Renee said, "I do not know. The email I got was forwarded to me by mistake. There may be more invoices that have gone to the right address all along." Camille said, "If there are, they are in his email and in Holloway's vendor records, neither of which we have access to." Renee said, "I know." Camille tapped her pen against the laptop screen. She said, "All right. 2 things. 1. This is a separate problem from the divorce. It is a cleaner problem in some ways because it does not require me to involve Holloway directly. We can route it through the state attorney general or through Holloway's outside auditor, which is a firm I happen to know. The second thing is that I want a forensic accountant on this before we do anything. I have someone. She is good and she is fast and she will find every other invoice that exists." Renee said, "What about the divorce?" Camille said, "The divorce is its own track. We can run them in parallel. I will draft your filing this weekend. We will not file until we are ready. When we file, we will have everything in order so that whatever he tries, we already have an answer." Renee said, "I do not want him to know yet." Camille said, "He is not going to know until you decide it is time for him to know." They ate noodles at the kitchen island. Camille kept the conversation light. She talked about her son's school project and her partner Daniel's new bike and a case she had won the week before. Renee listened. She felt her shoulders come down for the first time in 12 hours. Camille left at 10:30 with the email and the screenshots saved to a secure folder on a drive she had brought. Brent came home at 11:20. He kissed Renee on the forehead and said the dinner had been brutal and went straight upstairs. That weekend Renee found the second piece. It happened on Saturday morning. Brent had gone for his run. Renee was making coffee in the kitchen. Brent had left his phone on the counter, plugged into the charger on its back. The phone was face up. The screen was dark. Renee did not pick it up. She did not need to. The screen lit up at 8:12 with a message from Tasha. The preview showed 3 lines of text. The first line said, "Baby, last night was so good." The second line said, "Do you think she suspects anything?" The third line said, "She always looks like she does not see what is in front of her face, but I do not trust it." The screen went dark again. Renee stood at the counter and held the warm coffee mug in both hands and did not move. She took her own phone out of her pocket. She opened the camera. She framed the dark screen of Brent's phone in her camera viewfinder. She held still and she waited. The screen lit up again 2 minutes later, a follow-up message that said, "Call me when you get a minute." Renee took the photo. She took 3 of them, slightly different angles, all in focus with the timestamp visible on her own phone in the corner. She put her phone in her pocket. She set Brent's phone back exactly where it had been. She picked up her coffee and walked out onto the back deck and sat in the morning chair and looked at the yard and did not move for 10 minutes. Brent came home at 9:15, sweating in a good mood. He said, "What is for breakfast, beautiful?" Renee said, "Eggs." She made him eggs. She made him toast cut on the diagonal. She made him coffee from the small kettle. She set the plate in front of him and kissed him on the temple. He said, "You are a good wife, baby." She said, "Eat your eggs." He ate his eggs. She watched him chew. Once, 15 years ago, when they had been first married, Brent had been laid off from a job he had hated. He had come home and sat at this same kitchen island and put his head in his hands and cried, and she had stood behind him and put her arms around his shoulders and said, "We are going to be all right, we are going to be all right." She had meant it. She had stayed up that night writing his cover letters with him until 2 in the morning. She had pulled the down payment for that first apartment out of her own savings without ever once mentioning it. She thought about that morning while she watched him eat his eggs. She did not feel anything. That was the part that surprised her most. The absence of feeling. She had expected rage. She had expected grief. What she felt was the cold, clean clarity of a woman who had finished a long math problem and seen, finally, the answer at the bottom of the page. The numbers had added up. They had been adding up for months. She had simply been refusing to read the total. Now she had read it. She forwarded the photos of his phone screen to Camille at 10 in the morning, while Brent was in the shower. The message said, "This is from this morning." He left his phone on the counter. Camille wrote back at 10:03. "I have it. I am putting it in the file. Are you alright?" Renee wrote, "Yes." Camille wrote, "Are you really?" Renee wrote, "Yes. I am clear." Camille wrote, "That is a different thing than alright, but it is going to serve you better today." Renee said nothing for the rest of the afternoon. She did the laundry. She went to the grocery store. She came home and made dinner. She watched a movie on the couch with Brent and laughed at the parts that were supposed to be funny. When he reached for her hand on the couch, she did not pull away. She let him hold it. His thumb made small circles on the back of her hand, the way it always had. She had a thought, lying there with her hand in his hand, that came to her with clean, cold logic. The thought was this: a woman who knows her husband is cheating and pretends she does not is sometimes called a fool. A woman who knows her husband is cheating, who pretends she does not for exactly as long as she needs to in order to gather what she needs to gather, is called a strategist. Renee was a strategist. She always had been. She had simply never had to be one inside her own marriage before. Tuesday afternoon at her office, Janelle came in with 2 cups of coffee and shut the door behind her and sat down. Janelle said, "All right. You have not been you for 3 days. What is going on?" Renee looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "I am in the middle of something. I cannot talk about it yet. I will be able to talk about it in a few weeks. Do you trust me?" Janelle said, "Completely." Renee said, "Then trust me to come to you when I can. I just need you to know that I am all right. I'm not okay, but I am all right. There is a difference." Janelle nodded slowly. Janelle said, "What do you need from me right now?" Renee said, "Nothing. Just for you to keep being 2 doors down." Janelle said, "That is not a problem. I'm not going anywhere." She left the office and shut the door softly behind her. Renee turned back to her computer. There was a new email at the top of her inbox. It was from Howard Veracruz. The subject line said, "Thursday confirmation." The body of the email said, "Mrs. Caldwell. Confirming Thursday at 1 o'clock at our Tryon Street offices, 25th floor. Margaret Yoon, our senior partner here in Charlotte, will join us. She is a person of extraordinary discretion and I would like for you to know her. Dr. Bramble will arrive at 1:15. Please come up to reception and ask for Margaret. She will know. I will see you at the end of the appointment to discuss next steps. Sincerely, HV." Renee read the email twice. She replied, "Thank you. I will be there." She set the phone down. She looked at the watch on her wrist. The honey gold case caught the afternoon light from the window. She thought, "All right, grandmother. Thursday." The Veracruz Holdings office in Charlotte occupied the top 3 floors of a glass tower on Tryon Street. Renee took the elevator up to the 25th floor at 5 minutes to 1 on Thursday afternoon. She had taken a half day from work. She wore a deep blue knit dress and low heels and her grandmother's watch. Margaret Yoon met her at the reception desk. Margaret was a small woman with very straight posture and a soft voice that did not need to be loud to be heard. She wore a forest green suit and tortoiseshell glasses. She shook Renee's hand and led her down a long corridor with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city. Margaret said, "Mr. Veracruz speaks of you with great care. I'm glad you came." Renee said, "Thank you for arranging this." Margaret said, "This is what we do. Now, before we go in, I want you to know 2 things. The first is that nothing said in this room today obligates you to anything. You can walk out at any point. You can change your mind at any point. You are not on a timeline. The second is that if at any point you are uncomfortable with anyone in the room, including me, you tell me and that person will leave. Do you understand?" Renee said, "Yes." Margaret said, "All right. Let us go meet Dr. Bramble." The conference room was small and bright and lit by long windows along one side. Dr. Owen Bramble was already seated at the table when they came in. He was a thin elderly man with neatly combed white hair and gold-rimmed glasses and a small black case open on the table in front of him. He stood up when Renee entered. He shook her hand politely. He said, "Mrs. Caldwell, thank you for permitting me to look at this piece. Mr. Veracruz has been describing it to me for 30 years. I admit I am very curious." Howard Veracruz came in 2 minutes later. He looked, in the daylight, like a man who had been quietly excited for a week. Howard said, "Mrs. Caldwell, thank you for coming. Shall we?" Renee unbuckled the watch from her wrist. She handed it to Dr. Bramble. Dr. Bramble took the watch with both hands and laid it on a small velvet pad on the table. He put on a jeweler's loop. He examined the front of the watch. He examined the strap. He turned the watch over in his hand and pressed his thumbnail against the side of the case back, and the small panel popped open with that same quiet precision Renee had heard in the lobby of the steakhouse the week before. He read the engraving silently. He looked up. He said, "Mr. Veracruz, before I say anything, I want you to confirm something for me. The commission record from Atelier Berthet, dated April 1963, single piece 18-karat rose alloy case, cream lacquer dial, Roman numerals." Howard said yes. Dr. Bramble said the engraving inside the case back was specified by the client and entered by hand by the engraver, with the client's chosen text of 7 words. Howard said yes. Dr. Bramble said, "I have an exact copy of the original commission slip in my files. I've been carrying it with me for 18 years. He took a small folded paper out of his case and slid it across the table to Howard. Howard unfolded it. He looked at it. He looked at the engraving in the watch. He said, "The text matches exactly." Dr. Bramble said, "The case back numbering matches the commission slip. The dial signature matches. The crown engraving matches. The movement caliber will match if I am permitted to open the back." Renee said, "Please." Dr. Bramble opened the back of the watch with a small precision tool. He examined the movement under the loupe. He compared it against a number written on his commission slip. He said, "The movement serial matches." He looked up. He said, "Mrs. Caldwell, this is the watch. There is no doubt. The piece on this table was commissioned in Geneva in April 1963 by Bertram Hollings of New York City as a single specific work. There is no other watch like this anywhere in the world. I have been waiting for someone to walk in with it for almost half my career." Renee held herself very still. Dr. Bramble closed the case back. He polished the watch with a soft cloth. He laid it back on the velvet pad in front of her. He said, "May I ask you a question that is not strictly horological?" Renee said, "Of course." He said, "Who was Pearl Moseley to you?" Renee said, "My grandmother." Dr. Bramble said, "Do you know what Bertram Hollings did when he died?" Renee said, "No." Dr. Bramble looked at Howard. Howard nodded. Howard said, "Bertram Hollings died in 1981 at the age of 67. He had no wife. He had no children. He had no surviving siblings. He had 2 cousins, both of whom he disliked, and to whom he left, by the standards of Bertram Hollings, very small bequests. The bulk of his estate was placed into a charitable foundation that still exists today and still funds the medical research wing of 2 hospitals in Manhattan. But before his estate was settled, Bertram established 3 private trusts. One was for his housekeeper of 40 years. One was for his groundskeeper. The third was for Pearl Moseley." Renee said, "I never heard about a trust." Howard said, "No. I do not believe she did either." Margaret leaned forward. Margaret said, "I have spent the last 10 days reviewing the documentation. The trust was funded in 1981 in the amount of $260,000, which at the time was a substantial sum. It was structured to pay quarterly distributions to Pearl Moseley for the duration of her life, with the principal to revert to her descendants by name on her death. The trust was administered by a small private firm in Manhattan that has since been folded into a larger institution." Renee said, "My grandmother never received any payments." Margaret said, "No, she did not." Renee said, "Why?" Margaret said, "This is where it becomes a story rather than a record. From what we have been able to piece together, the trust documents listed an address for Pearl in Manhattan that was already out of date in 1981. By that point she had moved to Queens to be with her sister. The notice of the trust was sent to the Manhattan address. It came back. The administering firm, by the standards of the time and the limits of their effort, attempted to locate her. They were not able to. They made a small notation in the file. The trust went into a holding status. Quarterly distributions accumulated and were never dispersed. When Pearl passed 16 years ago, no one knew to inform the trust. The status remained as it was. The accumulated distributions and the principal have been sitting in that account, drawing interest since 1981. Renee said, "For 44 years. Margaret said, "Yes." Renee did not move. Howard said, "Mrs. Caldwell, the principal alone has grown substantially. Even at modest historical interest rates applied across 44 years, the trust as it stands today is a meaningful sum. We will run a precise calculation, but the figure is in the high 7 figures and possibly approaching 8. Renee felt the room go very quiet around her. She said, "I'm sorry. Could you say that number again?" Howard said, "It is between $4 million and $7 million. We will not know the exact figure until we have run the formal accounting and confirmed the schedule of historical distributions." Renee did not move for a long moment. She said, "My grandmother died in a 1-bedroom apartment with a leaking ceiling that the landlord refused to fix for 2 years." Howard said, "Yes, ma'am." I'm sorry. Renee said she worked for that man for 30 years. Howard said yes. Renee said, and he tried to give her something at the end. And it just sat there. Howard said it sat there. Margaret said, Mrs. Caldwell. The trust is recoverable. The documentation is in good order. Your descent from Pearl Mosley is documented through your mother and through the family records. The recovery process is administrative rather than contested. There is no other claimant. The principal reverts to her descendants by name. You are her only surviving direct descendant. Renee said, I know. She looked down at the watch on the velvet pad. She picked it up and buckled it back onto her wrist. She did it slowly and carefully. She felt the leather settle against her skin. She felt the small weight of the case against the bone of her wrist. She said, Mr. Veracruz. Mrs. Yoon. Dr. Bramble. I would like to ask for 2 things. The first is your help with the recovery of the trust. The second is a few days to think about what I want to do with what comes next. Both the trust and the watch. Howard said, you have both. Margaret said, take whatever time you need. We are not going anywhere. Dr. Bramble closed his case quietly. He said, Mrs. Caldwell. May I add one thing? Renee said, yes. He said, the watch itself, separate from the trust, is a documented historical piece of significant value. There are private collectors of mid-century Geneva commissions who would, with proper authentication and proper representation, pay a sum that is not modest. I have been in this field for 47 years. I have, on 3 separate occasions, helped clients of Mr. Veracruz arrange private sales of pieces of similar provenance. If at any point you wish to consider a sale, I am at your service. The watch belongs to you. What you do with it is your decision, and there is no decision that anyone in this room would consider the wrong one. Renee said, thank you, Dr. Bramble. He shook her hand. He left. Margaret, Howard, and Renee sat at the table for another 20 minutes. They did not talk about money. They talked about Pearl. Renee found herself telling Howard things she had not told anyone in years. The way Pearl had cooked rice. The way she had braided Renee's hair on Sunday afternoons. The small wooden box at the back of the closet with the watch inside. When she stood up to leave, she felt steadier than she had felt in months. She rode the elevator down with her grandmother's watch on her wrist and her phone in her hand. She texted Camille. The text said, file the divorce on Monday. Camille filed the divorce paperwork on a Monday morning at 9:45. She had spent the weekend at Renee's kitchen island with a stack of bank statements, property records, and a yellow legal pad covered in her own clean handwriting. By Sunday night they had a complete picture of the marital finances. The house in Charlotte had been purchased 8 years earlier with a $40,000 down payment that had come entirely from Renee's savings. The mortgage had been paid out of the joint account, into which both of them deposited monthly contributions, but Renee's contributions had averaged 62% of the total over the 8-year period because Brent had stretched 4 separate periods of light spending into reasons to put less in. They had a brokerage account with about $90,000 in it. They had 2 cars. They had no children, by mutual decision made years earlier, which Camille noted with a small dry comment about how that was at least one fewer thing for him to try to use as leverage. The divorce filing was clean. Renee was asking for the house, 50% of the brokerage account, her own car, her grandmother's watch, and a no-fault divorce. She was not asking for spousal support. She did not need it. She had not told Camille about the trust yet because the trust was not legally hers until the recovery process was complete, and Camille had drilled into her, gently but firmly, that the divorce had to be filed and resolved on the basis of what existed today, not on the basis of what was coming. Camille selected a Wednesday for the service. She selected 9 in the morning. She selected the lobby of the Holloway Industrial Building. She said the timing is on purpose. He cannot make a scene in his own lobby. He cannot get on a phone call before he gets to his office. By the time he can think clearly, he will already be at his desk and his co-workers will already have seen the process server. Renee said, that is intentional cruelty, Camille. Camille said, that is an intentional incentive structure. Cruelty would be having him served at his mother's house. There is a difference. Renee almost laughed. On Wednesday morning, Renee got dressed for work in her usual clothes. She made breakfast for Brent. He was distracted. He was on his phone the whole time. He kissed her on the temple as he left and said, see you tonight, baby, and was out the door at 7:20. Renee drove to her own office. She sat at her desk. At 9:10, her phone rang. It was Brent. She let it go to voicemail. It rang again 2 minutes later. She let that one go too. The third call came at 9:15. She did not pick up. He sent a text at 20 past. It said, what is this? Where are you? She did not respond. At 9:25 her phone rang again from a different number. It was Camille. Renee answered. Camille said he was served at 9:02. He was in the lobby with 3 other men. The server walked up, said his name, handed him the envelope and left. Brent opened it in the lobby. He went pale. 2 of the men he was with saw the cover page. He went up to his office and shut the door. That was 20 minutes ago. I expected him to call you within 5. He has called you 3 times. Are you all right? Renee said yes. Camille said, are you ready for tonight? Renee said yes. Camille said, do you want me to come over? Renee said no. I need to do this part by myself. He needs to see me alone. Camille said, all right. Call me when it is over. I will come pick you up if you need to leave the house. Renee said, I will call you. The rest of the day Renee worked. She kept her phone face down on her desk. Brent called 4 more times over the course of the morning. He called twice in the afternoon. He sent 5 texts. The texts moved from confused to angry to apologetic to angry again to a final one at 4:07 that simply said, we need to talk. Renee did not respond to any of them. She left work at 5:30. She drove home. She parked in the driveway. She did not put the garage door up. She walked to the front door and unlocked it and went inside. Brent was already home. He was sitting in the kitchen on one of the bar stools at the island. The envelope from the process server was on the counter in front of him. He looked up when she came in. His tie was loose. There was a bourbon in front of him that he had not drunk much of. He said, what is this? Renee set down her bag. She took off her coat. She hung it on the hook by the door. She walked to the kitchen. She said, exactly what it looks like. Brent said, you are filing for divorce. Renee said, yes. He said, on what grounds? Renee said, irreconcilable differences. It is a no-fault filing. You will not have to defend anything in court. Brent said, Renee, what is going on? She looked at him. She had been thinking about this conversation for 10 days. She had run it through her head in the shower and in the car and at her desk. She had decided exactly what she was going to say. She said, I know about Tasha. He stopped. He said, what? Renee said, I have known for a while. I have a copy of a message that was on your phone last Saturday morning. I have had time to think about it. I'm not interested in hearing your explanation. I'm not asking you any questions about it. Brent said, baby, listen, that is not what you think it is. Renee said, please do not do that. Brent said, I swear, Renee. Tasha she has been having a hard time. We have just been talking through some things. She has been struggling with her brother and with some other things. There is nothing happening. Renee said, Brent. I have a screenshot of a message that begins with the words, baby, last night was so good. I'm not having this conversation with you. He stopped. His face went through 3 things very fast. The thing it landed on was anger. He said, you went through my phone. Renee said, I did not. The phone was face up on the counter. The message lit up on the lock screen. I did not unlock anything. He said, you took a picture. Renee said, yes. He said, you have been planning this. Renee said, I have been gathering. There is a difference. He stood up from the bar stool. He said, all right. All right. Let us slow down. Let us talk about this. Whatever this is, whatever you think it is, we can work through this. 16 years, Renee. We have 16 years. Renee said, I have 16 years of waking up next to you. You have 16 years of having a wife who paid for your apartment when you were laid off and typed your applications and held your hand at your father's funeral and never once made you feel less than. You should think very carefully about whether what you have been doing for the last year was worth those 16 years. He said, I have not been doing anything. She said, Brent. He said, Renee, please. She walked past him to the counter. She picked up the envelope from the process server. She set it back down in front of him. She said, I am asking for the house. I am asking for 50% of the brokerage account. I'm asking for my car. I'm asking for my grandmother's watch. He laughed. It came out short and bitter. He said, your watch. The $40 watch. You think I am going to fight you for the $40 watch? Take it. Take it and go. Renee looked at him for a long moment. She said, I wanted to say one thing about the watch. Howard Veracruz authenticated it last Thursday. The watch is not a $40 watch. The watch is a single-piece commission from Geneva from 1963. There are private collectors who would pay a substantial sum for it. Substantial. Brent stopped. He said, what are you talking about? Renee said, you laughed at me at that dinner. You let your colleagues laugh. You let Tasha laugh. You did it in a room with the only man in this country who could have looked at that watch and known what it was. And he did. Brent said, you are not telling me the watch is worth money. Renee said, I am telling you the watch is worth a great deal of money. I'm also telling you that I am not asking you for any of it. I am asking for the watch because the watch is mine, and because my grandmother gave it to me and because you laughed at it. None of those reasons require you to know its value. She turned and walked toward the stairs. He said, Renee. She did not stop. He said, where are you going? She said, I am sleeping in the guest room tonight. Tomorrow I am sleeping at Camille's. The day after that I am back at home and you are at a hotel until we sort out the rest. Camille will send the proposed schedule by email tomorrow. She walked up the stairs. She closed the guest room door behind her. She locked it. She sat on the edge of the guest bed. She did not cry. She picked up her phone. She called Camille. She said, it is done. I told him. Camille said, how was it? Renee said, it was the cleanest thing I have done in a very long time. Camille had already been working with the forensic accountant for 2 weeks by the time the divorce was filed. The accountant's name was Doris Kemper. She was 61 years old, semi-retired, and had spent 28 years auditing companies on behalf of the federal government before going into private practice. Camille had used her on 3 previous cases. Doris worked from a small home office in a suburb on the south side of Charlotte and answered her phone with a precise, dry, fast voice that did not waste a single word. Doris had been given the email Renee found, the screenshot of the LinkedIn profile, and the registration record for Pierce Advisory. She had been asked to find what else existed. She had found a great deal. She delivered her preliminary report on a Friday afternoon, 10 days after the divorce had been filed. Camille drove to Renee's house with a clean printed binder under her arm. Renee was alone. She had moved back into the house. Brent had moved into a hotel suite by the airport, which Camille had selected for him on purpose because it was inconvenient for him to get to Holloway. Camille set the binder on the kitchen island. She said, all right. Doris is good. This is what we have. There were 9 separate invoices from Pierce Advisory to Holloway Industrial across the previous 11 months. Each one was for less than $50,000. Each one would have crossed Brent's desk for approval at the director level. Each one was for consulting services described in vague language that did not match any real deliverable. Doris had cross-referenced the invoice dates against Holloway's project records, which she had not been able to access directly but had been able to reconstruct from regulatory filings and from public procurement records on similar contracts. She had found no evidence that any work corresponding to the invoices had actually been performed. The total billed across the 11 months was $412,000. Doris had also pulled the Pierce Advisory bank record, which was findable through the company's registration. The deposits from Holloway had landed in a single business account at a small regional bank. Roughly 70% of the funds had been transferred out of that account, in monthly disbursements, to a personal account held by Tasha Pierce. Renee read the report carefully. She did not move quickly. Camille did not rush her. When she finished, Renee looked up. Renee said, the woman is taking money from her brother who is taking money from a fake consulting contract that her boyfriend is approving from his employer. Camille said, that is the simple version, yes. Renee said, this is not just an affair. This is theft. Camille said, this is fraud. Specifically, this is procurement fraud. It is also a violation of Brent's fiduciary duty to his employer. If Holloway Industrial is publicly traded, and they are, this also potentially implicates federal securities regulations. If we report this to the right people, it does not stay a private matter. Renee said, who do we tell? Camille said, we do not tell Holloway directly. If we do, they have an incentive to sweep it up internally and protect their own reputation. We file a complaint with the state attorney general's office. We send a separate letter to Holloway's outside auditor, a firm called Greenslit Partners, which I have a relationship with. The complaint and the letter go out the same day. Greenslit is required by professional standards to look into anything brought to them in writing. The attorney general's office is not required to act, but they will because procurement fraud at a regional manufacturing firm is exactly the kind of clean win they like to take. Renee said, what happens to him? Camille said, what happens to Brent depends on what Greenslit and the attorney general find. If they find what we found and Doris's documentation is what it is, then Holloway will have no choice but to act. Brent loses his job. Tasha loses her job. Tasha's brother is the one who actually owns Pierce Advisory and is the registered recipient of the funds, so the criminal exposure lands hardest on him. Brent's exposure depends on whether Holloway pursues civil restitution and whether the attorney general pursues criminal charges. He may not be charged criminally. He almost certainly loses his career in this industry. Renee said Tasha. Camille said Tasha will be fired. She is more legally exposed than Brent because she is the one who personally received the diverted funds. She will likely be charged. She will likely settle for a payment plan rather than face trial. But her name will be in the public record. She will not work in any office in this region again. Renee said, all right. Camille said, I'm not going to tell you what to feel about that. Renee said, I do not feel anything about that. Camille said, are you sure? Renee said, my husband and his assistant have been stealing from his employer for the better part of a year while she has been sleeping with him in hotel rooms my mortgage is paying for. I'm sure. Camille said, all right. Renee said, file it. Camille filed the complaint with the Attorney General's office that Friday afternoon. She sent the letter to Greenslet Partners by courier the same day. The letter included Doris's preliminary report as an attachment. The audit landed at Holloway on Monday morning. Renee heard about the meetings secondhand through Janelle, who heard about them through a friend who worked in human resources at Holloway. Brent was summoned to a meeting at 10 on Tuesday morning with two senior partners from Greenslet and Holloway's general counsel. He was in the meeting for almost 3 hours. Tasha was summoned to a separate meeting on Wednesday morning. She was in her meeting for less than an hour. By Friday afternoon, both of them were on administrative leave with pay pending the conclusion of the audit. By the following Wednesday, both of them were terminated for cause. Tasha's brother Jared had a knock on his front door from a state investigator on Thursday morning. Pierce Advisory's bank account was frozen by Friday. Renee learned this in pieces as the days went by. She did not feel triumph. She did not feel grief. She felt the same cold, clean clarity she had felt the morning she watched Brent eat his eggs. Mr. Holloway himself called her on the second Monday after the audit had begun. Renee took the call in her office at the accounting firm. She closed the door. Mr. Holloway said, Mrs. Caldwell, forgive the directness of this call. I have been the chief executive of this company for 22 years. I have built this company carefully. What your husband has been doing has caused harm to a great many people inside this organization, and I want you to know that I am personally embarrassed by it. I have spoken with Brent in this office a dozen times over his 5 years here. I considered him a personal protege. I'm sorry. Renee said, Mr. Holloway, you did not steal from your own company. You do not need to apologize to me for what someone else did. Mr. Holloway said, I am told that the audit was prompted by a complaint that came from outside this company. I am told that the documentation supporting that complaint was unusually well prepared. I have my suspicions about who prepared it. I'm not going to ask you to confirm them. Renee said, that is wise. Mr. Holloway laughed. It was a tired laugh. He said, Mrs. Caldwell, if you ever need anything from me, professionally or personally, please call. You have my number. Renee said, thank you. She hung up. She sat at her desk and looked out the window for a long moment. Then she picked up her phone and called Howard Veracruz. Howard answered on the second ring. Renee said, Mr. Veracruz, I would like to come up to your office on Thursday if you have time. I have made some decisions. Howard said, I have time. I will rearrange things if I do not. What time works for you? Renee said, 2 o'clock. Howard said, 2 o'clock. I will see you Thursday. Renee hung up. She turned to her computer. There was an email at the top of her inbox from Camille. The subject line said, Greenslet preliminary findings. The body said, attached. Read it when you have time. Renee opened the attachment. The findings were exactly what Doris had predicted. Greenslet had recovered roughly $390,000 of the diverted funds from the Pierce Advisory account before it was frozen. The remaining $22,000 had been spent and would need to be recovered through civil action. Brent's role had been characterized as approving authority for fraudulent invoices. The report recommended termination, civil restitution, and referral for potential criminal prosecution. Renee closed the report. She thought about her grandmother for a moment. Pearl had worked her whole life. She had typed thousands of pages of correspondence for a man who had quietly been one of the wealthiest men in Manhattan. She had run his life. She had kept his calendar. She had corrected his grammar. She had never once asked him for anything. He had given her a watch and a trust she had never known about, and the trust had sat in a vault for 44 years, drawing interest, while Pearl had lived in a one-bedroom apartment in Queens with a leaking ceiling. Renee had a thought. It was the thought that had been forming for a week. It had a clean shape now. She picked up her phone. She called Janelle. She said, Janelle, are you free for lunch tomorrow? Janelle said, of course. Renee said, I want to talk to you about something. It is going to take an hour. Can you keep it private? Janelle said, Renee, I have been keeping things private for you for 11 years. What is it? Renee said, I'm going to start something. I want you to be a part of it. Renee met Janelle for lunch at a small bistro near the office that had a quiet back room. She told Janelle everything. The dinner. The watch. Howard Veracruz. Bertram Hollings. The trust. The forensic accountant. The audit. The divorce. She told her in order. She did not skip anything. Janelle sat across from her with her water glass untouched and her salad untouched and listened with her hands folded on the table. When Renee was done, Janelle was quiet for a long moment. Janelle said, "Your grandmother." Renee said, "Yes." Janelle said, "$4 to $7 million. Renee said, "Yes." Janelle said, "All right. I have to ask the obvious thing. What are you going to do with it?" Renee said, "That is what I want to talk to you about." Janelle said, "I am listening." Renee said, "My grandmother typed letters for 30 years. She managed a man's calendar. She ran a private office. She did not have a college degree. She did not have any title that mattered to anyone outside that office. The man she worked for understood at the end what she had been to him. He tried to give her something. The system failed her. The notice went to an old address. No one looked harder. She lived the rest of her life in a one-bedroom apartment in Queens. The money sat in a vault for 44 years. Janelle said, "Yes." Renee said, "There are women like my grandmother in every office in this country. Not the founders. Not the partners. The women who type and file and answer the phone and remember which client takes cream in their coffee and which client's daughter is in college. The women who keep the lights on. They are not seen. They are not mentored. They do not get the door opened for them. They watch the door close behind people they helped get hired." Janelle said, "Yes." Renee said, "I want to start a foundation. I want to call it the Pearl Mosley Foundation. I want it to do two things. The first is to provide scholarships for Black women going into accounting, finance, and administrative careers. Real scholarships. Tuition, books, a stipend, the whole thing. The second is mentorship. We connect every scholarship recipient to a working professional in their field who agrees to be available for them for 2 years. Real mentorship. Standing meetings. Honest feedback. Door opening." Janelle said, "Renee." Renee said, "I want you to run the operations side of it. Full time. I will pay you what you are making at the firm plus 30%. Full benefits. I want you to leave the firm and come do this with me." Janelle said, "You are serious?" Renee said, "I am serious." Janelle said, "When does this start?" Renee said, "The trust is recoverable in roughly 2 months according to Margaret Yoon. The watch authentication is complete. I can sell the watch privately and have proceeds in roughly 6 weeks. I have an appointment with Howard on Thursday to talk about a private sale to one of the collectors Dr. Bramble mentioned. Between the watch sale and the trust, the foundation will have between $5 and $8 million in initial funding. That is enough to support 20 scholarships a year for 10 years and have endowment left over." Janelle said, "You are doing this?" Renee said, "I am doing this." Janelle said, "I have to tell my husband." Renee said, "Of course." Janelle said, "I'm going to say yes. I just have to tell him. I do not need his permission. I just want him to know." Renee said, "Take your time." Janelle said, "Renee." Renee said, "What?" Janelle said, "Your grandmother is going to be so proud." Renee did not say anything. She looked at her plate. She did not let herself cry. Not in the bistro. Not in front of Janelle. She would cry later, alone, the way she had been doing once a week since the divorce was filed, in the guest bathroom upstairs with the water running. She said, "I hope so." The Thursday meeting at Veracruz Holdings was longer than the first one. Margaret had prepared a clean folder with the recovery paperwork for the trust, the documentation Renee would need to sign, the timeline for distribution and the tax implications. The recovery process would take roughly 8 to 10 weeks. Renee would need to provide certified copies of her birth certificate, her mother's birth certificate, Pearl's death certificate, and her own marriage certificate, as well as proof of identity. The administering institution would do its own verification. There was no contested process because there was no other claimant. Howard had arranged a separate conversation about the watch. Howard said, "Mrs. Caldwell, Dr. Bramble has, with your permission, made discreet inquiries to 3 private collectors he knows have an interest in this period. All 3 have responded. All 3 have made offers. The highest offer is from a private collector in Switzerland whose family has been collecting Atelier Berthoud commissions for 2 generations. He has offered a sum that I think you will find reasonable." He slid a folded paper across the table. Renee opened it. She read the number. She read it again. She said, "Mr. Veracruz." Howard said, "Yes." Renee said, "This is for the watch alone." Howard said, "Yes." "Separate from the trust." Renee said, "This is one watch." Howard said, "This is one extremely rare watch with documented provenance and an emotional connection to a famous figure in mid-century American finance. Bertram Hollings is well known to people who collect this period. The story of the commission has been told for decades. The story of the recovery when it becomes public will only increase the value. The collector knows all of this. He has been waiting for this watch for 19 years. Renee said, "All right." Howard said, you do not have to decide today. Renee said, I do not need to think about it. I want to sell the watch. Howard said, may I ask why? Renee said, my grandmother kept the watch in a wooden box for 40 years. She gave it to me on her deathbed and made me promise to wear it. She did not give it to me to keep in a drawer. She gave it to me to use. I do not know why she gave it to me specifically. I have a guess. I think she gave it to me because she knew I would do something with it. I'm going to do something with it. Howard said, I will arrange the sale. Renee said, thank you. I would also like to ask Mrs. Yoon a question. Margaret said, please. Renee said, the foundation I want to start. Would your firm be willing to advise on the investment of the endowment? Margaret looked at Howard. Howard said, Mrs. Yoon, I think you have just been recruited. Margaret smiled. She said, Mrs. Caldwell, it would be my honor. The watch sale was finalized 6 weeks later. The funds were wired into a foundation account that Camille had spent those same 6 weeks setting up with Renee. The Pearl Mosley Foundation was incorporated as a private nonprofit in the state of North Carolina. Its mission was as Renee had stated. Its initial board consisted of Renee, Camille, Janelle, Margaret Yoon, and a senior administrator at North Carolina Central University whom Camille had introduced to Renee at a fundraising luncheon. The trust recovery took 10 weeks. The final figure, after the administering institution's accounting was complete, was $5,800,000 and change. Renee directed all of it into the foundation, less a portion she set aside in a private trust for her own retirement and her mother's care. Pearl's daughter, Renee's mother, lived in a small assisted living facility in South Carolina. Renee paid her facility fees in full from that point forward and arranged for a private aide 3 days a week. Her mother had not understood much of what Renee told her about the trust. Her mother had cried when Renee told her about the foundation, and that was enough. Renee took the watch off the day Howard's office wired the proceeds. She bought a small steel watch from a department store for $140. It was a simple silver case with a black face and white Roman numerals. It looked like nothing. It kept time perfectly. She wore it from that day forward. The wooden box from her grandmother's closet, with her grandmother's writing on the bottom in a small careful hand that read for my Renee, sat empty on Renee's dresser. She did not need the watch anymore. The watch had done what it was sent to do. Loretta Caldwell drove into Charlotte on a bright Saturday in late spring. She arrived at 11:15 and parked her car at the curb in front of the small Italian restaurant on Providence Road that Renee had picked. Renee had not seen Loretta since the divorce had been filed, more than 3 months earlier. They had spoken on the phone twice. Both calls had been short and careful, and Loretta had said, at the end of the second call, "Baby, I know what my son did. I have known for longer than you think." Renee had not pushed her on it. Now Loretta sat across from Renee at a small corner table by the window. She wore a deep maroon blouse and small pearl earrings, and her short gray hair was freshly cut. She looked, in the spring light, like a woman who had decided something difficult and was at peace with the decision. She said, "You look thinner." Renee said, "I know." Loretta said, "Are you sleeping?" Renee said, "Mostly." Loretta said, "Eat first, talk after." They ordered. Loretta had a baked ziti. Renee had a salad with chicken. They ate. Loretta talked about her garden and about the church choir and about a friend who had moved to Florida. Renee listened. By the time their plates were cleared, the front of Renee's chest had loosened, the way it had not loosened in any room that contained a Caldwell for almost a year. Loretta set down her fork. Loretta said, "I want to say something." Renee said, "All right." Loretta said, "I knew Brent had grown into something I did not raise. I have known it for longer than I have wanted to admit. He started telling small lies in his late 20s. They got bigger when he got into Holloway. The way he started talking about you changed. He used to talk about you like you were the smartest person he knew. Then he started talking about you like you were a thing he had. Like a car. I noticed. I did not say anything. I should have." Renee said, "You do not owe me an apology, Loretta." Loretta said, "I am not apologizing for what he did. I am apologizing for what I did not say." Renee said, "All right." Loretta said, "My mother. Your great-grandmother. Did you ever hear about her work?" Renee said, "I know she worked. I know she raised 4 children mostly alone. I know she made it possible for Pearl to go to school in New York." Loretta said, "My mother cleaned houses in Charleston for 47 years. She started when she was 13. She cleaned for the same family for the last 22 years of her career. 5 generations of that family lived in that house while she was working there. She was at the house every weekday from 7 in the morning until 5 in the evening. She raised 4 of us on what she made cleaning that house. She bought a small house of our own with that money. That house is the house I grew up in. It is also the house I sold 10 years ago to fund Brent's MBA, because he asked me to. Renee said, you sold your mother's house for him. Loretta said, yes. He told me he would pay me back. He paid me back $12,000 of the $85,000 it sold for. He stopped paying me back after the third payment because, as he put it, things had gotten tight. Renee was quiet. Loretta said, I have been thinking a lot about my mother in the last few months. I have been thinking about your grandmother too. I went to Pearl's funeral. I sat next to you. You were 22. Renee said, I remember. Loretta said, I remember thinking, that woman raised a daughter who raised this granddaughter, and the line from one to the next is a kind of strength I do not see in my own line. I remember thinking that. I have been thinking about it again since I heard about the watch. Renee said, who told you about the watch? Loretta said, your friend Camille called me. She asked permission to call. She said you might not have time to explain things and she wanted to make sure I understood what was happening. She told me. She told me about the trust. She told me about the foundation. Renee said she should not have done that without telling me. Loretta said, do not be angry with her. I asked her to. She called me to ask if I was all right. I asked her what was actually happening. She told me. She said you would be in touch when you were ready. Renee said, all right. Loretta said, I want you to listen to me. I'm not asking for anything. I'm not going to ask for anything. I'm not going to mention it again after today. I want to say one thing. Renee said, all right. Loretta said, the way you handled this, the way you have handled all of this, the way you took something that was meant to make you small and turned it into something that is going to make 100 other young women not small. That is a thing my mother would have understood. That is a thing your grandmother would have understood. I'm proud of you. I'm proud to know you. I'm sorry that the man I raised was the reason you had to do it. But I am proud of you. Renee felt the tears come up. She did not try to stop them. She let them sit in her eyes for a moment and then she let them fall, 2 of them, and she wiped them away with the back of her hand. She said, thank you, Loretta. Loretta said, will you come to Sunday dinner at my house in 2 weeks? Renee said, yes. Loretta said, good. She paid for lunch over Renee's protest. They walked out to her car. Loretta hugged Renee at the curb. She held the hug for longer than she usually did. She got in her car and drove back out of the city. The divorce was finalized 3 days later. The court appearance was brief. The judge asked the standard questions. Renee said yes to all of them. Brent's lawyer asked for one final consideration on the brokerage account split, which the judge denied. The judge signed the order. The marriage of 15 years and 7 months ended at 10:03 on a Wednesday morning. Camille and Renee had agreed in advance to leave through the side entrance. They did. Brent, who had been hoping to corner Renee in the hallway after the proceeding, came out the front entrance and found her car already gone from the parking lot. He called her at 6 in the evening. Renee was in her kitchen. She had just gotten home from work. She looked at his name on the screen of her phone for a long moment. Then she picked up. She said, Brent. He said, Renee. He sounded tired. He sounded like a man who had been drinking, although she could not be sure. He said, I just wanted to talk to you. She said, all right. He said, I never imagined this was how this would end. She said, no. He said, I want you to know I am sorry. She said, all right. He said, I want you to know that I am going to be all right. I'm going to land on my feet. I have a few options. There is a firm in Atlanta. There is also some restructuring work I am doing for an old friend. I'm going to be fine. She said, Brent. He said, yes. She said, I'm not asking how you are going to be. He stopped. He said, what? She said, I have not asked how you are going to be. You did not need to tell me. You did not need to tell me because nobody asked. I want you to think about that. Tomorrow. Next week. Next year. Every time you find yourself wanting to tell someone how you are going to be when nobody has asked, think about why you are telling them. He was silent. She said, I'm only going to say one more thing, Brent. I want you to listen. He said, okay. She said, you laughed at the watch. He said, Renee. She said, you laughed at the watch. At a table. In front of your colleagues. With another woman next to you who was already in your bed. The watch was the only thing my grandmother gave me. The watch was the only thing my grandmother gave me and you laughed at it. I want you to know that I am not angry about it. I want you to know that I have not been angry about anything for a long time. The thing I want you to know is this. I will spend the rest of my life remembering how easy it was for you to laugh at something that mattered to me. And I will spend the rest of my life making sure I never give that easiness to anyone else. Not to a man. Not to a friend. Not to a coworker. Not to anyone. You did not just laugh at a watch. You taught me a lesson. I am thankful for the lesson. I'm not thankful for what it cost. He did not say anything. She said, take care of yourself, Brent. She ended the call. She set the phone face down on the counter. She poured herself a glass of water from the pitcher in the refrigerator. She drank it standing at the sink. She looked out the window at the small yard. The grass was getting long. She would call someone tomorrow. Then she went upstairs and she took a shower and she went to bed and she slept all the way through the night for the first time in 9 months. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, the Pearl Mosley Foundation held its launch reception at a small bright event space on the second floor of a renovated mill building in downtown Charlotte. Renee had picked the space herself. It had tall industrial windows along 2 walls and white painted brick and polished concrete floors and a long wooden table at one end where the catering had been set up. The afternoon light came in pale and even, no shadows in the corners, no gold tones, no haze. The space looked the way Renee felt. Clear. She had been at the venue since 9 that morning. Janelle had been there since 7. The two of them had spent the morning walking through the program with the events coordinator, checking the placement of the signage, testing the microphone. The signage was simple. It said, in clean white letters on a deep blue background, the Pearl Mosley Foundation. There was no other logo. There was no slogan. Renee had been firm about that. The reception was scheduled to start at 3. By 2:30 the room had begun to fill. Camille came in with her partner Daniel and went straight to the snack table, where she handed Renee a small wrapped box she said was just a little something. Inside was a brass paperweight engraved with the foundation's name and the date. Renee held it for a moment. She did not say anything. She just nodded at Camille. Camille nodded back. They had been doing that for 20 years. It had always been enough. Margaret Yoon arrived at 2:40. She had brought her husband, a quiet older man who worked at one of the universities. She introduced him to Renee. He shook Renee's hand and said, "My wife has not stopped talking about this work for 5 months. Thank you for letting her be part of it." Howard Veracruz flew in from New York and walked in at 2:45. He was wearing the same plain navy suit he had worn at the steakhouse almost a year before. He had a small bouquet of white flowers in his hand, which he handed to Renee with a small bow. Howard said, "Mrs. Caldwell. Or I should say, Miss Caldwell." Renee said, "Renee is fine." Howard said, "Renee. Bertram would have loved this." Renee said, "My grandmother would have loved this." Howard said, "Yes. They both would have." He put his hand briefly on her shoulder and went to find a seat. Loretta came in at 5 minutes to 3. She was wearing the same maroon blouse from the lunch in the spring. She walked in slowly and looked around the room and found Renee. She came over and held Renee's face in both hands for a moment and did not say anything. Then she said, "Your grandmother is here today, baby. She is right here." She let go and went to sit in the front row. Renee's mother could not travel. Renee had hired a private nurse to spend the afternoon with her. The nurse had been instructed to play a recording of the speech later, with subtitles on the television, and to read it to Renee's mother slowly, word by word, in case she missed any of it. Renee had recorded the speech the night before, knowing she would deliver it again at the live reception. At 3 sharp, Renee took the small stage at the front of the room. There were maybe 120 people in the audience. Most of them were people connected to the foundation, the board, the early donors, the partner organizations, and the first cohort of scholarship recipients, who had been notified 2 weeks earlier and invited to the launch. There were 8 scholarship recipients in the first cohort. They sat together in the 3rd row. Renee had met 5 of them in person already. The other 3 had come from out of state. Renee wore a deep red dress with 3/4 sleeves. The dress had been a recommendation from Janelle, who had said, when Renee had asked her opinion, "You do not wear red, and today you should." Her hair was pulled back into a low chignon. She wore the small steel watch from the department store. She did not need anything else. She stepped up to the microphone. She looked out at the room. She said, "Thank you all for being here." She let that sit for a moment. She said, "The woman this foundation is named for was my grandmother. Her name was Pearl Mosley. She lived for 79 years. She was born in South Carolina in 1925. She moved to Manhattan when she was 19. She worked, in the years between then and her retirement, as a private secretary for one man for 30 years. She typed his letters. She kept his calendar. She corrected his grammar. She managed his life. She made it possible for him to do everything he ever did. When she retired, she moved to Queens to take care of her sister. She lived in a small apartment for the rest of her life. She raised my mother on her own. She helped my mother raise me. She taught me how to cook rice. She taught me how to braid hair. She taught me, without ever saying it out loud, that the women who keep the lights on in offices are the women who keep the lights on in entire industries, and that those women do not always get their names on the door. Pearl never got her name on a door." Renee paused. She said, "Today we put her name on a door." The room was very still. Renee said, "The Pearl Mosley Foundation will provide full scholarships, mentorship and professional support to Black women entering the fields of accounting, finance, and administrative work. We will support 20 new students per year. Each student will be matched with a working professional in her field who will commit to 2 years of standing meetings. Each student will have her tuition paid in full. Each student will have a stipend for books and living expenses. Each student will leave her program with a job placement support team behind her. We are not interested in giving anyone a check. We are interested in giving women the same things my grandmother spent 30 years quietly giving to other people. Tom. Attention. The benefit of someone's full presence. We start this work today. She turned and looked at the 8 young women in the third row. She said to the first cohort, "Thank you for choosing us. We are choosing you back." The room broke into applause. Renee waited for the applause to settle. She said, "I want to thank a few people. My friend Camille, who has been my lawyer and my best friend for 20 years and who is the only reason I am standing here. My friend Janelle, who is the operations director of this foundation and who left a job she had held for 11 years to come do this with me. Margaret Yoon, who has been wiser to me than any teacher I have ever had. Mr. Howard Veracruz, who walked into a steakhouse one night and saw something he had been looking for 45 years, and who could have walked back out and said nothing, and who chose instead to stop and ask me a question. Loretta Caldwell, my mother-in-law for many years and my friend now, who is in the front row. My mother, Constance Mosley, who is at home in South Carolina watching this on a recording later this afternoon, and who I love very much." She paused. She said, "And finally, my grandmother." She held up her wrist. The small steel watch caught the light. She said, "This is not the watch she gave me. The watch she gave me is in another country now, with a man who has loved that piece of work for 19 years. He paid a great deal for it. The proceeds are why we are standing in this room today. The watch she gave me did exactly what she meant it to do. It came home in my hand and it left in someone else's hand, and on its way out of the door it became, for the women in the third row of this audience, the beginning of a life they were not promised. I hope you can see this." She stepped back from the microphone. The room stood up. Renee did not cry. She had cried plenty in the months leading up to this moment. There were no tears left for this part. This part was the bright, clean part. This part was the part she had been walking toward since she had sat in the kitchen at 1 in the morning and called Camille, almost a year before. After the speech there was a small reception. Renee walked the room and shook hands. She found her way to the third row eventually. She introduced herself to each of the 8 scholarship recipients in person. The last one she came to was a young woman who had driven up from Atlanta that morning. The young woman was 22 years old. She had a small notebook in her hand. She had introduced herself to Renee as Yvonne Carter. She was the first person in her family to attend college. She was about to start a master's program in forensic accounting. Yvonne looked at Renee. She held out her hand. Yvonne said, "Miss Caldwell, I want to tell you that my grandmother was a private nurse for 37 years. She raised my mother and my aunt on what she made doing private night shifts. She passed 2 years ago. She told me before she went that I was going to do something she did not get to do. I did not know what she meant. I think I know now." Renee held Yvonne's hand. She said, "You are going to do something you did not get to do either, Yvonne. Both of those things are true." Yvonne nodded. She did not let go of Renee's hand for a moment. Then she did. Renee watched her walk back to her seat. She watched her sit down and open her notebook and write something in it. Renee turned and looked across the bright room. The afternoon light was still coming in pale and even through the tall windows. Janelle was laughing with one of the donors near the back. Camille was talking to Loretta. Margaret was standing with Howard and a woman from the local press. Brent was not there. Tasha was not there. They were both, in their own separate places, trying to figure out what to do with the ruins of choices they had made. That was their work, not Renee's. Renee picked up a glass of water from the table and held it in her hand and looked at the room one more time. She said very quietly, only for herself, "All right, grandmother. We did it." Then she went to greet the next person who was waiting to shake her hand.